How's everybody doing today? And today we're going to do a reaction video on the history of Pennsylvania in 13 minutes. Now, many of you might not know this, but I am a native of Pennsylvania. I grew up there. I lived there most of my life. I no longer live there, but I lived north of Philadelphia pretty much most of my life, except for the past 5 or 6 years. And then also some time when I was in the Army. So Pennsylvania has a great place in my heart. And there's a lot of things in here that I will know and some things I might not know. So let's start the journey together on the history of Pennsylvania. The original link to this video will be in the description below. So you can go out and check their channel and give them full credit. Please make sure you subscribe to their channel as well and help support these guys. So let's get started.
The state of Pennsylvania has a deep and fascinating history. As one of the original 13 colonies, it also holds an important place in the history of the United States. Pennsylvania's history began long before any humans lived there. What would become eastern North America was underwater during the Cambrian geologic period.
And this is kind of interesting. My ex-brother-in-law, who was big into fossils, used to go fossil digging in central Pennsylvania. There's all sorts of cruel fossils from this time period.
540 million years ago, and was also much closer to the equator. The shallow sea and warm climate meant there was a great deal of marine life. As these hard-shelled animals died and sank to the bottom, they created layers of calcium-rich sedimentary rocks, including limestone and gypsum, both of which would be important for the industries of the 19th and 20th centuries. About 100 million years later, another shifting of the plates brought the erosion of a nearby mountain range, creating shale, within which set the oil and gas deposits that are so valuable in the modern day.
You would not believe how valuable and how embedded in the history of Pennsylvania both these two items are. Where I lived, there wasn't a lot of, say, the oil and stuff, but where I lived, we were pretty close to the coal mines. Coal mines were huge in Pennsylvania up until, well, they're still in Pennsylvania, but in the area I was up till about maybe the 1950s or 1960s, it started to go away. So it was very impactful, and you can still feel the remnants of it today.
This was followed by a Carboniferous era, so called because of the great deal of lush vegetation that settled onto the ground over millions of years and eventually compressed to become coal, yet another resource important to Pennsylvanians.
And if you see this here, Welsh miner, my cousin was doing some research, and I recently found out in the past couple years that my family was from Wales on my grandmother's side, my mom's mother's side, and they all settled in these coal mining areas, which is really cool. They were involved in a lot of the coal mining history, and a number of them fought in the Civil War from regiments in the coal mining areas, like the 96th and 95th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry during the Civil War.
The first human inhabitants of the eastern part of North America were descendants of the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, when glaciers reduced the sea level and exposed a vast and rich grassland between Siberia and Alaska. Over the course of a few thousand years, groups made their way from what is now Alaska all the way to the southern tip of South America, some staying here or there, becoming the ancestors of the modern indigenous peoples of the Americas. In what would become Pennsylvania, the native peoples lived a semi-sedentary life, practicing agriculture, but also keeping to a seasonal round of hunting and gathering to supplement what they'd cultivated.
Interesting thing about Pennsylvania is the natives that are there generally don't trace their lineage to the natives that lived there before the American or the British or the Dutch or whoever moved there, the Swiss. They a lot of those natives have died off, so it's very hard to find a genuine native from the state of Pennsylvania. They did exist, but anybody that's a pure blood, I would say mother and father, that, there's no other ethnicity involved in them, is very, very difficult. I don't think any exists. I've never met any those people.
These people were members of the Algonquin and Iroquoian language groups, including the Delaware, Atagoe, Monongahela, Erie, Lenape, Susquehannock, Tuscarora, and other tribes. The first Europeans in what would become Pennsylvania were members of the short-lived New Sweden colony, established in 1643.
Interesting thing about New Sweden and down around the Delaware Bay, near modern-day Philadelphia, Chester County, that area. I actually had a show years ago called Things You Didn't Know, and there was an old Swiss cabin that was considered one of the oldest houses in Pennsylvania. This place was built 450 years ago or so. It was a long time ago, and it was still intact, and they used to shoot silent movies there back at the turn of the last century in like 1910. So it was really cool, and this was before even the English took over. It was part of the fur trading route. We did a show there. It was pretty cool.
They lived alongside the English colonies of Jamestown and Maryland, and the outcomes of a few European wars meant that the British gained control over the area in 1674. 7 years later, King Charles II of England granted a large tract of land to William Penn in payment of a debt. The king named it Penn.
So for those of you not familiar, William Penn, if you're from Philadelphia, they have the big William Penn statue. It's one of the highest statues in the state of Pennsylvania, and it's this statue bust of William Penn. Penn's Woods. That's what basically Pennsylvania means.
Pennsylvania, meaning Penn's Forest, which Penn disliked because it made him look conceited, as people would assume that he named it, not the king. Penn was a member of the Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers, who are an offshoot of the Anglican Church. Quakers believed that if God created all people equal, they should be treated as such, and so were strict
You would not believe how big the Quaker religion is in Pennsylvania. I mean, I lived near a town called Quakertown, but the Quaker churches are all over there. They were very involved in the early part of Pennsylvania, and they're still involved. There's a lot of Quakers. They don't believe in fighting wars. They're very peaceful, plain folk. So Quakers are really one of the dominant religions in Pennsylvania.
Egalitarians. They refused to recognize the privileges of aristocrats and class distinctions. They were also strict pacifists. These traits made them troublesome for England, where it was feared that they would cause major disruptions to the hierarchy, even so far as the authority of the king. So, when King Charles II had the opportunity to pay a debt while also encouraging a trying group of people to leave England, he saw an opportunity. Penn also saw this as a chance for himself and his co-religionists to put their ideals into practice outside of an overreaching government that did not agree with them. William Penn.
This is one of the reasons why a lot of people compare America, the United States, I should say, to Australia. We're a country of outcasts, both our countries. Australia was a prison colony, and a lot of outcasts went there, poor people. Same with the United States. They were sent there for religious reasons or just people that they didn't deem as part of proper English or European society. So this is where we're a lot like Australia, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why the United States and Australia get along so well, is we're a country of outcasts, both of us.
Arranged for land sales before even having seen the colony. The first colonists and Penn set out in August of 1682, arriving on the shore of North America in October. He sorted out the land grants and purchases, then set up the capital of Philadelphia. He returned to England the next summer to respond to financial and political disputes, both in his personal life and as regarded the colony. When he returned to Pennsylvania the next year, he applied Quaker principles to his dealings with the local tribes. Penn made a point of treating the natives as equals, or at least as fellow humans, and not simply something that stood between them and the ownership of the land.
An interesting thing is, I was just in London, and I did not know this until I was in London. Apparently, William Penn is buried in London, which would have been cool for me as a native Pennsylvanian to see his grave, if that be the case. If I get back over there, I'm definitely going to have to check it out.
Because of this policy, Pennsylvania was unusual in that it required no fortification or protections against the actions of the local tribespeople. This policy did not, however, outlive William Penn. Over the rest of his life, he spent a great deal more time in England than he did in his colony. He died in 1718. Though many of Penn's governing policies fell by the wayside while he was not in residence and after his death, one that remained and was a cornerstone of how Pennsylvania operated was religious tolerance. Members of
And this is one of the things, being from East Coast of Pennsylvania, one of the original 13 colonies. You go to these states, whether it's Massachusetts, New York, Georgia, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Delaware, there's a different feeling about those states than the rest of the United States. I mean, we love the other states, don't get us wrong, but we feel like we're the old men of the group. And the structures and the buildings, I mean, for the exception of Florida that has St. Augustine, but the structures and the buildings in these original 13 colonies, you can definitely tell the difference versus if you go to like out west or even someplace like Ohio. There's a big difference, and we kind of have this thing like we're the original people in the country.
Of every Christian sect and denomination were welcome in Pennsylvania, and so it became a haven for those who, like Quakers, were annoying to their governments. Huguenots, Calvinists, Mennonites, and even Catholics found refuge and the freedom to practice their
Mennonites. So where I grew up in Upper Bucks County and part of, I guess you would say, northeast Montgomery County, is all full of Mennonites. I went to school with tons of people that were Mennonites. They're not quite like Quakers, but they're close to Quakers. I don't want to compare, but the Mennonites and they were definitely different. They dated amongst themselves. They were not Amish. They didn't show up with buggies and that type of stuff, but they dated, they married amongst themselves. They hung out, they went to church. They were a very closed community. Even to this day, they are. And they dress like you and I, they act like you and I, but they only stay within their realms. And there was like a handful of last names that they were all the same in the school districts up there. So very interesting.
Their faith in the colony. The Society of Friends also encouraged members of these groups to be involved in government, as this solved a bit of a problem because they did not believe in taking oaths. Many of them were not comfortable acting in government roles, and because they did not believe in standing in judgment over other people, they could not be judges. Without non-Quakers, Pennsylvania would not have functioned. However, the presence of those who were not members of the society required that they allow practices of which they did not approve, like slavery. By the mid-18th century, slaveholding was as common in this colony as the others, and even some Quakers owned slaves.
Which is interesting, because when you study American history today, most people don't realize that slaves were all throughout the United States. It was not just a Southern thing. As a matter of fact, there were still slaves in the state of New Jersey after the Civil War until the Constitution got amended to do away with them. So the Civil War ends, and 6 months later, there were still slaves in South New Jersey up until like January 1st, 1866. So Pennsylvania did have its share of slaves. It did away with them very early through a progressionary system. But just think about that. There were slaves in the state of Pennsylvania.
By mid-century, the English government decided to make Pennsylvania a crown colony, like the other American colonies. Conflicts with local tribes over the location of borders after the 1737 walking purchase, along with unresolved issues over the colony's governance, were major factors. The Quakers abdicated control in 1756, just as the French and Indian War broke out and brought to a head conflict with their neighbors over their policy of strict pacifism. Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia particularly, was instrumental to the American Revolution. The two Continental Congresses were held in the city. It served as the capital of...
By far, you'll hear some debate, but people will say either Pennsylvania's Philadelphia, New York City, or Massachusetts and Boston, Massachusetts, were the three most important cities. I'm partial. I'll say Philadelphia, but other people will say Boston, New York. But you can't argue the part that Pennsylvania and Philadelphia especially played in the founding of this country and up until the present day. You just can't. It's one of the most important cities in the United States.
Of the new United States for a short time, and the city hosted the Constitutional Convention in 1784. The state was also home to the first major internal conflict for the new country, the Whiskey Rebellion.
Most people forget about this. It was not just the Whiskey Rebellion. There was another rebellion called Freeze Rebellion, which I'll be doing a video on my other channel, some original content that we're doing a documentary on. There was a number of rebellions in Pennsylvania. The Whiskey Rebellion tends to get the most attention because it was probably the biggest of them all. But there was another one called Freeze Rebellion that was just about, as the crow flies, about an hour north of Philadelphia today, in between the Lehigh Valley and Philadelphia.
This took the form of a refusal to pay taxes on distilled spirits, which the people involved justified by pointing to the examples of the American colonists' response to the tea and stamp taxes that they believed to be illegitimate. It was put down in 1794 by President George Washington, whose appearance at the head of an army seems to have been enough to cause a retreat and willing payment of the taxes. In the 19th century, Philadelphia became a cultural center for the young nation, with the country's first museum, stock exchange, and college of medicine. Pennsylvania was also the first state to abolish slavery, though it did so with a gradual emancipation, meaning it was 1847 when the last enslaved people in the state were made free.
So what they meant by the gradual emancipation is that if you were born after a certain date, you were free, and it worked that way. But again, you're looking at, there's really not that much time difference between the last slaves being freed in Pennsylvania and the start of the American Civil War, although Pennsylvania was very heavily involved in the Underground Railway. And no, it wasn't a train that went underground. Most people think that.
Given that it was a free state and shared a border with Virginia, Pennsylvania had an incredibly important role in the American Civil War. A few major battles were fought in the state, of which Gettysburg is the best known. The location of this battle is the furthest point north reached by the Confederate Army. They did not try.
I would argue that point. Gettysburg was not the furthest most point, maybe of the major army. Chambersburg was captured and burned the year before. And then also it was captured the year after Gettysburg. So there was that. There was also a raid in St. Albans, Vermont. And if you want to talk major battles, okay, I'll give you that. Pennsylvania was a big target. The South wanted to capture Harrisburg. That would have been great. The state capital. They would have loved to have captured Philadelphia, which was one of the biggest cities in the United States. It would not have happened. That city was too big, and the South would not have had the resources to lay siege. That just would not have happened. But I would argue whether or not it was the furthest north, maybe by major military force. We'll go with that. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt with that.
To push further into Union territory after that. The Union victory after 3 days of intense fighting at Gettysburg was a turning point of the war, after which the Confederate surrender seemed inevitable. The state was also an important element in the creation of wealth during the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. The magnates of the era, Jay Gould, John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and others, all used the natural resources of Pennsylvania to fuel their companies.
And this is interesting. If you head out to the western part of Pennsylvania, once you start getting west of Harrisburg, it's a different Pennsylvania than eastern Pennsylvania. And as you get out west, closer to Pittsburgh, Du Bois, all that area out there, McKeesport, you get this feeling of this time frame of the what they called the robber barons, the Gilded Age. that stuff did exist in Philadelphia as well, but there's an older atmosphere, and you can definitely tell when you go Western Pennsylvania versus Eastern Pennsylvania that Eastern Pennsylvania is definitely older, but there's still the remnants of these robber barons 130 years left after they left in Western Pennsylvania, especially Pittsburgh area.
Way these businesses functioned spurred workers' rights and unionization efforts amongst their employees. But their employers were not shy about using any methods, even violent ones, for union busting. Pennsylvania's industry was incredibly important to World War I, as it would be for World War II. At the end of the Great War, like so much of the world, the state was hit with an outbreak of the 1919 influenza, also known as the Spanish flu. A war bond parade
and one of the interesting things about the Spanish flu is in the small town I grew up in, there was I believe it was an army hospital at some point. I've never been able to actually find where it was at, but there was some sort of a military hospital, and there was soldiers buried in a local cemetery, and it says, died of the influenza or something like that on their headstone. And always didn't know what that was till I was, much older, and I started researching this. But very, very interesting.
in Philadelphia became an example of what not to do during a pandemic. The crowd of 200,000 people not only collected money for the war effort, but also collected germs. Thousands of people fell ill within a few days, and a good number of them died. The Great Depression, beginning with the stock market crash on the 29th of October 1929, was a worldwide financial disaster, and Pennsylvania was not shielded from it. In fact, the state Supreme Court made the situation worse, as they ruled that elements of the New Deal violated the state constitution, and so reduced the amount of federal aid available to the state by the New Deal programs.
This is a little bit misleading. It wasn't just the state of Pennsylvania that found a lot of the New Deal unconstitutional. It was also the U.S. Supreme Court found a lot of the New Deal was unconstitutional. And this goes back to the switch at 9 at 5 to save time or whatever, with Franklin Roosevelt threatening to put more Supreme Court justices on the Supreme Court if they didn't pass his laws, and they kind of backed out. So FDR didn't flood the court. This is a whole thing. This is not just a Pennsylvania thing. This is a national thing. The Supreme Court later backed down because Roosevelt threatened to put in, 5-6 different additional judges to pass everything he wanted, playing politics with the court, not unlike today, what people try to do.
Like the rest of the country, however, the massive federal spending programs associated with World War II pulled the state back from the brink. With its iron resources, steel mills, and other assets, Pennsylvania produced about 6% of the armaments made for use by the United States during the war.
Where I grew up, just a little bit north of me, was Bethlehem Steel. It was a huge steel mill. And I think that later closed up in like 1995. I just either was getting out of high school or had graduated high school when the steel mill had closed down. But there were thousands of people employed at Bethlehem Steel. But I remember driving past that place. It's a casino now, but just seeing the buildings, and they seem so old, like 100 years ago. And Billy Joel wrote that song, Allentown, about Bethlehem Steel. So steel did play a big part. And when it shut down, it killed Bethlehem, it killed Allentown, it killed these cities. And it took years for them to rebound. Unfortunately, other industries and tourism moved in, but the steel leaving was felt for a really long time.
Another product made in Pennsylvania was also incredibly important to both the war effort and the post-war rebuilding work: the Hershey bar. The continued importance of manufacturing through the post-war era created a strong blue-collar middle class for about a generation.
The Hershey bar. If you ever get to Hershey, Pennsylvania, they have Hershey Kisses as the light bulb heads along the streets. You can smell the chocolate from a mile away, miles away. I shouldn't even say a mile away, miles and miles away. Pennsylvania definitely was blue collar. I mean, when I was growing up, blue collar. Most everybody worked in a factory or worked some sort of trade. That's changed a lot. I think my generation was the last. I remember when I got out of high school, a lot of people were working in trades and working in factories. I don't think that that's really the case anymore. There are some, but not to the magnitude it was, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. That was still there.
However, by the early 1980s, a massive reduction in steel manufacturing and a slower reduction in coal mining left previously thriving communities destitute. In the last decades of the 20th century, the state shifted to more service industry employment in the technology sectors. It has also become an important swing state for U.S. presidential elections. From its geologic prehistory to the lives of the native tribes, to its involvement in the creation of the United States as we know it, Pennsylvania has a rich and fascinating history that will undoubtedly influence it toward a bright future.
So that's Pennsylvania. It's a pretty cool history. It's Knowledge IA. If you want to follow them on YouTube, great channel. This is the 30,000 mile view of Pennsylvania. You could spend years and years talking about different histories of Pennsylvania. But if you like what you saw, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Share this video and follow us and check out our other videos. And we would really appreciate your support. Until next time, thanks.